me with an opportunity to respond to comment on Phil's work. I've known Phil's work for a while. I then met Phil himself and followed his work more closely, and I am a real admirer of Phil's work. I think that Phil asks the right questions. First of all, he asks comparative questions which are not only comparative in the sense of comparing phenomena, but rather trying to explain how transplantation or copying of ideas is occurring from one civilization to the other. I also like Phil's work because he connects economic reality with law, which is something I also do a lot in my work. What I would like to do today is to put Phil's work in a context, not to get into the details of the work. I'm not an expert in the period, but rather to put it in the context of some other scholarly work on related topics, to compare the various pieces of literature, as we'll see, his first book to the second and to some other works, and try to see what are the implicit assumptions of each of these works, and what can we make by identifying these assumptions and working with them or working against these assumptions. And as I show, it deals a lot with the question of what's the role of theory and methodology in this kind of historical research. So we had a Princeton school, which Phil was kind of drawn into and came to criticize. The Princeton school is best exemplified by Goita and Ludovic, who were mentioned by Phil. And as Phil presents the Princeton school in his first work, in his first book, the Princeton school has 3 points of observations and misses a fourth one. That is, there is good evidence as to Jewish legal texts, there is ample of Islamic legal texts, there are records of mercantile practices of Jews in Cairo, in Fustat, and the networks that come out of Cairo for at least 2 to 3 centuries. And there is almost no evidence as to Islamic mercantile practices in that period for half a millennia or so. So the Princeton school assumes that we can infer as to Muslim practices through observation of Jewish practices. So there is a similarity here, there is a similarity here, so we can infer a similarity here, and in a way also here. That's roughly the Princeton school way of walking around the missing records for Islamic commercial practices in the Islamic heydays. And the Princeton school, in effect, makes the Gniza scholars highly important beyond the scope of Jewish law and Jewish history, making the historians of the Gniza highly important for the entire Middle East for half a millennia. Phil, in his first book, The Business of Identity, criticizes this assumption. That is, he basically argues that there is a good match between the Gniza practices and Jewish legal texts, but there is no match between no good match between the Gniza practices and Islamic legal texts, and he suggests that this came to be the case because the relationship between Islamic law and Jewish law of the period is complex. It's not as simple as we've seen it as a unidirectional influence by the majority Islamic Middle East on Jewish law, but rather there is what he calls the specular relational model of relationship. What does this model mean? It means that when the minority looks at the majority, it can sometimes copy the majority, sometimes reject the majority, sometimes being influenced by the structural mental structures of the majority without copying the details of the majority. So in a way you get a much more complex relationship, and as a result, Jewish legal forms or Jewish forms of organizing business, the ones that were mentioned today as well, are not identical to Islamic law, and Jewish practices that follow Jewish legal organizational models cannot be identical to Muslim practices. And this is, in a way, highly innovative, but somewhat disappointing for a kind of a self-defeating kind of argument in terms of the relevance of the scholars of the Geniza to the history of Islam or the Middle East in general. So that's his point. And initially, when I invited me to comment, I assumed that I'd be asked to comment on the first book. And I liked the idea because I happened to write a book review on the first book. I don't know whether you've seen it yet, or I don't know whether it was out. The Mediterranean Historical Review, it should be out. And that's basically I like the book. Much of the review is about what I like about the book. The parts in red here are almost as bad as the ones in orange here. No, they're not that bad, but in a sense, so one point is that, in a way, Phil argues that the Geniza practices reflect business models that could be found in Babylonia a few centuries earlier, and the question is, how come? And why is it so? How come we find good matching between practices of Cairo of the 11th, 12th century with high text, high normative texts of Babylonia of the 6th, 7th, and 8th or 9th century? Why is it? I mean, it wasn't my intuition that we find such a match, and you find it. And the question is, if I understand you correctly, and the question is why? I would have expected much better matching with Maimonides Mishneh Torah than with the Talmud and the Geonim. And then I would like to ask you later on, can you reconcile this with your paper today as well? My second point is, when you look at the legal texts of the Geniza, you get a sense that the Jewish courts of Cairo are willing to enforce Islamic forms of organization, most famously the Commander or the Kirad al-Goyim as it is known. So if they are not expecting Islamic forms into the normative text, how come they are willing to enforce them in the courts of Cairo? That's not intuitive. I mean, there are differences obviously between adopting something into the normative text and adopting it in kind of and enforcing it, but still, how come they are willing to do this? And you also argue that the Jewish merchant practices are distinct from the Islamic practices of the time and place due to some differences between the Jews and the Muslims. And so what are exactly these differences? Are they just technical? Are they just in forms that are detached from culture and identity? Or do you see any differences that reflect different communal values, different religious values? So what's the identity behind the differences? And lastly, you favored the model that I've mentioned, that is the specular relational model, and I would like to get a better sense of what the model is. I understand what it means in general, but the question I had was whether it is predictive in any sense. Can you predict in advance, based on some factors, what will be the outcome? When will you be copying? When will you be rejecting? Otherwise, you can kind of experiment through the model any kind of findings you might identify in the practices. I now want to kind of move to today's paper. Again, here is the conventional wisdom. The next slide will be Phil's criticism of the conventional wisdom. And don't be mistaken, I'm in favor of criticizing conventional wisdoms. I think that the Princeton School conventional wisdom is by now 40, 50 years old, maybe 60 years old, and it's time to reassess it rather than to assume that it is appropriate. The same applies here. So the conventional wisdom is, as we presented it today, is that there was an urbanization in Mesopotamia, Iraq, the Abbasid Caliphate, there was a process of urbanization, commercialization that affected both Islamic law and Jewish law, and in Jewish law you can see what's kind of the environment, the social economic environment is transforming, and the law is transforming as a response to this. This is the common wisdom, and you are questioning it, and this is the context. This is the Abbasid Empire, so the capital of the empire had moved from Damascus to Baghdad, the empire had expanded, it was involved now in Central Asian Silk Road, as well as Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean trade, and this is the result in terms of Islamic commerce, Islamic law, Jewish commerce, and Jewish law. And now it could be based to some extent on some solid evidence. We don't have much solid evidence as to what's going on in trade. So Phil is trying to tell us something about trade through legal texts, because we don't know much about trade. We don't really know much about trade in the Indian Ocean at the time. We don't know much about overland trade at the time, because evidence was not preserved. Shipwrecks just dissolved in the Indian Ocean over time. They did not survive till modernity, and there isn't much evidence for quantities of trade in Central Asia. You can see some infrastructure, but you cannot really relate this infrastructure like some of the khans and rabbats that you find along the way. You cannot really know how much was going through them in different periods. You don't. The only place you have solid evidence with respect to is the Mediterranean, because there are shipwrecks. And what you can see is obviously the heyday of the kind of Hellenistic Roman heyday, and then a sharp decline and some revival. So one could attribute to this revival urbanization, growth in trade, and the manifestation of this in law. But some others could say that's not meaningful. I mean, it's just a marginal rise after a very sharp decline. And secondly, it's the Mediterranean. It's not Mesopotamia. And it shows something about maritime trade, nothing about overland trade. It might reflect some Latin Christian trade rather than Islamic trade. So there's much more work to be done before assuming that this evidence says something about the grand narrative of trade in the Middle East. So what's Phil's argument today in his paper and in his second book in general? The argument is that indeed Islamic law went through a transformation at a very early period, the very first, second centuries of Islam, if not before. I wasn't sure whether you said that Islamic law was from the start more pro-commercial, more commercialized, whether it inherited from any earlier law, and if it did inherit it from any earlier law, from which earlier law did it inherit it, because some historians would say that there was much there was no significant trade in Arabia before Islam, Patricia Cron and others. Islam, Arabia was on the margins of trade, rather than the center of trade. How exactly did it incorporate kind of Roman, Byzantine, or Roman provincial law into the early Islamic law? I mean, if I might assist in this, Lina Salaymi might, but I wanted to get a better sense of what's the timing and cause of the transformation of Islamic law from pre-commercial to commercial. So you argue that, in fact, there was such a shift in Islamic law. You can see from early on this, but in fact, in Jewish law, you don't see it. You don't see it. You kind of identify the change only with Maimonides or 11th, 12th, 13th century. You don't identify any shift in the 8th, 9th, 10th century. That's if I understand correctly. And from this, you you assume or you try to understand what's going on in the environment. And your interpretation is that the stagnation in law reflects a stagnation or reflects the fact that there was no major transformation in the Jewish communities. So in a way, your methodology is to go to the legal texts, read the legal text, and from the legal text, infer the material reality of Mesopotamia of the time. So I guess what are the assumptions here? The assumptions here are that this is a good exercise. That is that from reading the text you can understand the reality. You might, but I would like you to get into a more minute kind of analysis of what exactly can you infer from what. That is, there are different types of legal texts. Can we infer the same from codes and from responsa? My intuition would be that codes and interpretations of codes might be in a much more considerable lag of time in its relationship, in its reflection of reality than responsa, and I would have expected this to be seen clearly. In addition to this, I would have expected different legal realms to respond to reality differently. That is, in some realms, you might use old forms and taking a long way without seeing any change in the law in the books. In some realms, it might be different. That is, profit sharing and profit splitting seems to be relatively easily maneuverable in various non-legal or semi-legal or means, whereas usury seems to be a major obstacle that one has to deal with, confront more directly at a relatively early stage. I might be wrong, but I would expect different legs in different fields of law. Not the same legs in all fields with respect to all law trends. And I would also, if that's the exercise, you don't necessarily have to look at the bottom lines. Sometimes you can find indications for commerce which are just incidental to doctrinal discussions. You can search for words, for example. You don't have to look for explicit discussions of the doctrines of partnerships. You can just find kind of incidental kind of lower level reflections of changing reality. I think that it is a worthwhile exercise to look for this as well. And then the question is, what do we learn from this about trade? Do we think that trade was, the Jews were not involved in trade, or do we think that trade as a whole, including non-Jewish trade, was small scale at the time? Were we observing, as most of the writers were around here, did we just miss activity that was going on here that was not reflected in the canonical texts? So I would like to get a better sense of what one would expect to be reflected, what types of commercial activities would one expect to be reflected in the legal text, and which types of commercial activities, maybe marginal, maybe small scale, maybe high innovative. Can we kind of infer from this something about the community at large? After all, even in Cairo, we believe in retrospect that the ones that were involved in long-distance trade were a relatively small group of persons that were fortunate enough to identify through the Geniza. Otherwise, we could have missed them, just as we missed many other groups of merchants, Jewish or Muslim, in other places. And then there is the question of, so the law, the decline of the Abbasid Empire was also coincided with the rise of the Mongol Empire. So trade could be on the rise generally, but in decline for the Jewish community of Baghdad. Because the Mongol Empire period is considered to be Pax Mongolica by many. It is considered to be a high day for long-distance trade for those groups who could benefit from the Mongolian peace. It was a low day for those who could not benefit from the Mongolian trade. Muslims or Jews of Iraq seems to be the ones that were among the losers, rather than others were among the leaders. And in a way, this became an alternative. What we see in the Geniza became an alternative to the trade from Iraq, because while the Mongols controlled this part, this was a way around into India. So when we are talking about urbanization, commercializations, there are different routes, different goods, different groups of merchants, and not all of them will be captured to the same extent by the same legal text. Now, I would like to refer to two more works you're familiar with, you've referred to. One of them is the book by Eckstein and Botticini, The Chosen Few, How Education Shaped Jewish History. Their argument basically is that because Jews became literate earlier on, and they became literate because of religious expectations, religious transformations related to the destruction of the temple and the rise of scholarly Judaism, Jews were literate. Jews had to invest a lot in this literacy because of their religious requirements, and they enjoyed a relative advantage in terms of the human capital in those occupations and sectors in which literacy was a significant benefit, such as trade. That is, the Jews became shopkeepers, traders, moneylenders, scholars, physicians, because they could read and write, because they could conduct their accounts, because they could conclude agreements, because they could correspond with their fellow Jews. And once they had this relative advantage, they started migrating. Obviously, you are criticizing this argument because they were detached from land, from agriculture. They could migrate to North Africa, to Cairo, and on into North Africa. And it's not only that they could benefit from the migration by creating diasporic communities and diasporic networks of merchants. And Jews became more and more of the Jews became merchants, and those Jews who did not become merchants did not keep their Judaism. That's their argument. Obviously, you criticize it. I understand in another chapter of this book, not in this chapter. I would like to read your criticism of this. So if one buys this argument, I don't say that we have to buy it, but if one buys this argument, one would not expect Jews to be like Muslims. That is, high percentage of the Jews were traders, low percentage of the Muslims were traded. There was no reason to assume the Jewish law would look like Islamic law. It makes sense that Jewish law would go through commercialization before Islamic law, which is just in contradiction to what you've said. It doesn't mean that they are correct and you are not. You might be the one who has the upper end in terms of your evidence, but it's either that, we have to be more explicit with respect to our notion of whether Jews were different from Muslims or similar to Muslims in terms of the real life occupations and commercial activities. Different conclusions with respect to this might lead us to different reading of the legal text and the other way around. So I was wondering whether you believe that Muslims and Jews were commercialized to the same extent, and if not, what will be your explanation for the fact that Muslims became more commercialized than Jews earlier on, which is, if I understand correctly, your assumption of based on what you read in the legal text. Mark Cohen is doing a different exercise. So Mark Cohen, in his forthcoming book, is looking at the Jewish side, comparing practices to legal texts. He's fortunate to have both ends. Because in the exercises we've seen so far, there was a sphere about which there was no historical evidence, and one had to extrapolate or infer as to what was going on in that sphere. Mark does not venture out of where we have records, but rather maintains his investigation in a place in which you have both law in the books and law in action. And his argument is that by reading the practices of the Geniza, one can better understand the normative texts, and particularly Mishneh Torah. And he says that what in fact Maimonides did in Mishneh Torah, we are talking about of partnerships and business organizations, is not to alter the basic forms, but rather to maintain, to keep a facade of maintaining the basic Talmudic forms, but allowing customs in. By allowing customs in, you seem to allow Jewish customs in, but in fact you allow Islamic customs in. Without calling them Islamic, without showing any sign of influence by Islamic law. So, this last sentence, in fact, assumes the Princeton School's assumption. That is, it assumes that the customs of Jewish merchants in Cairo are similar to the customs of Islamic merchants in Cairo, and Phil, rightly so, questions this assumption. So I guess the challenge is to reconcile all of this, or to identify which of the assumptions convince us and which of the assumptions really require some unpacking and more critical scrutiny. And as you see, each of them has some assumptions. How much time do I have? Yes. So I'll do a quick promo of my own book and then conclude. So what I'm doing in my kind of book in the making, the forthcoming book, is looking at the organization of Euro-Asian trade in early times, mostly 1400 to 1700, much beyond the time frame discussed by Phil and the others. And what the kind of the analytical framework I'm using here identified three types of institutions. Type 1 are indigenous endemic multiple inventions that are very basic, very intuitive. They kind of address basic functional needs that show up in a variety of civilizations, and then you can see similar solutions in similar civilizations which are not being copied from one to the other, but rather independently invented or developed in each of these environments through practices and through law. The second type of institutions are the ones that had a single place of invention, maybe multiple, two places of invention, and then migrated to other places. The commander that we were talking about today is type 2 institution. The more general partnerships, I believe, are type 1 institutions, and then there is type 3 institutions, which are institutions that were developed, invented, shaped in one civilizational context and did not migrate because of some hindrances, because of some resistance in other civilizations. So these are the three types of basic categorizations of institutions that I'm working with. And my general argument is that the more complex an institution is, the more embedded it is in culture, in religion, in politics, the less likely it is to migrate, and to the contrary at the other end. And I'm working on several case studies, mostly in my period. The Geniza is one of the very first cases I'm working on, and going on to the Dutch and English East India companies that were formed in 1600. That's roughly my So what can one take from my project to what we're discussing here today? So first of all, we might identify which institutions have developed in Jewish law and Islamic law in separation and independent from each other, and then not to assume that there is some influence, some copying, some borrowing from one to the other. Secondly, there are some institutions that may have been copied and moved around. The Commander, the Kirat el-Goyim, is an example for this, but one has to realize that the Islamic and Jewish contexts are not the only contexts through which they migrated. They migrated, as you can see, throughout Eurasia, all the way from the Middle East to the Baltics, to the Hanseatic League, to Britain, Central Asia and China, to obviously Italy, the Armenian merchants. So I believe that we can benefit by understanding the wider context. We should be aware of the wider context when trying to understand what was going on between Jews and Muslims in the relevant period. What else? It really is interesting to see which institutions did not migrate. So there are some examples for institutions that did not that were formed in Europe, but were not formed in the Middle East and did not migrate from Europe to the Middle East. The cooperation is such example. The kind of institution, the organizational form I'm a bit puzzled by and couldn't figure out is Siloam. The Siloam is something that could be found in the Byzantine codes. It could be found in 11th, 12th, 13th century Italy and beyond. Could not be found in Islam. And I was wondering how do the Jewish texts view the Siloam? So the cases in which there is no transplantation are, in my view, as interesting as the ones in which one observes migration. And the question is why there are differences. Usually those are a place about which I would like to know more about the differences in usually those between Judaism and Islam and obviously Christianity. And then there is a very an interesting distinction I think we can make more of, which is the distinction between migration between civilizations and interaction between majority and minority. So the Jews are quite exceptional in the sense of being a minority. They are not the only minority that is being influenced by the surrounding, but it is a minority, and in that respect, there might be different models such as the one that you have suggested that apply to the interaction between majority and minority and between various majority cultures. And lastly, so I think that we're working on different levels. One of them is the level of theory, one of them is the level of methodology, and we're not always clear as to what's the difference between them. So one of the questions I would like to pose is whether we have a clear theory of how law develops and how law migrates, and whether we try to understand reality through the theory, or don't we prescribe to theory any predictive values. If you look at different theories of the way law migrates, Marxist theory provides relatively claims for being able to predict things. Whereas some of the economic theories, their predictive value or the self-claimed predictive value is much smaller. All they say is that they can kind of take the complex reality and call our attention to some aspects of that complex reality so that we better understand that. So theory can play different roles. Some of our assumptions are based on theories which in fact do not claim to be predictive. And that's kind of problematic in my view. Some of our assumptions relate to the way in which we read the sources. Again, we have to be more careful as to how do we read the sources, and what are we looking at the sources for, and what could we conclude by looking at the sources. So I think that one of the ways to unpack our assumptions is to try and better identify whether our assumptions are based on kind of some grand historical narratives, whether our assumptions will result from the way we think we can read documents, and some of our assumptions relate stem from the way in which we understand the development of law. So I think that I'll stop here. Thanks very much.